Alright, hi friends, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you're watching this video. I hope you're having a really good day, and today I am going to continue reading our book, Gooney, Bird, Green. Now this book we've been reading in class 1 and class 2, so I'm going to start in chapter 3, and yeah, let's figure out what Gooney Bird is up to, because she's been telling some stories to her class and all that other crazy stuff. So let's see what she's up to now in chapter 3. Alright? On Friday, Gooney Bird was wearing capri pants, a satin tank top, and a long string of pearls. Her red hair was twisted into one long braid, which was decorated with plastic flowers. There were flip-flops on her feet. "You look beautiful," said Calico. Calico said to Gooney Bird in an admiring whisper. "Yes, I know," Gooney Bird replied. "Thank you, Calico." She walked to the front of the classroom where Mrs. Pigeon told her it was time. Malcolm was back in the classroom. He was at his desk writing, "I would never put anything in my nose 100 times on a piece of lined paper." The nurse had told him to do that. She said it would help keep his hands busy. "How come Gooney Bird gets to go stand in front of the class?" Malcolm asked. "Shh. Everybody except Felicia Ann," said to Malcolm. "Listen. Today," Gooney Bird said, "I have a very exciting story to tell you. In my story, there is a long journey, a mystery, and a rescue." Mrs. Pigeon, seated at her desk, had begun correcting some spelling papers. She looked up. "Listen, second grader," she said. "Hear the different things that Gooney Bird is putting into her story. That is what good storytellers do." Gooney Bird listened patiently to the teacher. Then she stood up straight and did some breathing exercises. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at the class. "I am ready to begin," she said at last. "The title of the story for today will be How Gooney Bird Came from China on a Flying Carpet." "Just like Aladdin," Barry Tuckerman said in a loud whisper. "Barry, pay attention please," Gooney Bird said. "I like to have absolutely all eyes on me." Then, when the class became silent, all except Felicia Ann, who had been silent all along, and almost all eyes, even Miss Pigeon's, were on her, and she began. How Gooney Bird Came from China on a Flying Carpet. Once upon a time, just last month, Mr. and Mrs. Green decided to take their little girl, Gooney Bird, and move away from the place where they had always lived. They had always lived in China, but now Mr. Green had a new job, and his new job was in Watertown. "That's here," Chelsea said aloud. "I live in Watertown." Gooney Bird stopped talking. She arranged her pearl necklace so that it was draped over one shoulder. "Me too," said Teresa said. "We all live here in Watertown," Ben pointed out. "That's why we go to Watertown Elementary School." "Class," Miss Pigeon warned. "Miss Pigeon," Gooney said politely, "let me take care of this." "Children," she said in a firm voice, "I cannot tell a story if I am constantly interrupted. There will be a time for questions and comments. Please raise your hand if you want to say something. It's very distracting for me if you call out." "Sorry," Teresa said. "Sorry," Chelsea said. "Sorry," Ben added. The class waited. Gooney Bird looked at them all sternly. Then she did some breathing exercises and began again. They had always lived in China, but now Mr. Green had a new job, and his new job was in Watertown. So they packed carefully. It took many days. First, Mr. Green had to pack 43 sets of false teeth. Then, Mrs. Green had to pack her dancing shoes and her bathing suits. And Gooney Bird had to pack all of her belongings, which included a money collection. Finally, their furniture was loaded onto a moving van, and the Green family waved goodbye as the moving van drove away from China and started its journey to Watertown. Gooney Bird stopped. Every child in the classroom had a hand raised, and even Mrs. Pigeon was waving her arm. I'll have an intermission now for questions, Gooney Bird said. Chelsea, yours first. Why did Mr. Green have 43 pairs of false teeth? Chelsea asked. The false teeth are not a part of this story, Gooney Bird said. Malcolm? Malcolm had looked up from his I would not put anything in my newspaper. His eyes were very wide. Tell about the money collection, he said. That's another story, Gooney Bird said. Beanie? When are you going to tell about the prince and the diamonds? Beanie asked. Gooney Bird thought it over. On Monday I'll tell it. And she said, now there's time for one more question before I continue, Mrs. Pigeon. Did you have your hand raised? Mrs. Pigeon nodded. Gooney Bird, she said in a nice voice, you have an amazing imagination, and we think that you are wonderful at telling stories, don't we, class? She looked around, and almost all of the children nodded. But I want to be certain that the children understand that these are made-up stories. So I want to point out, my stories are absolutely true, Gooney Bird said. I want to point out, Miss Pigeon went on, that of course we all know that China is a foreign country across the ocean and that a moving van could never drive from China to Watertown. Gooney Bird rearranged her pearls and sighed. Miss Pigeon, she said, why don't we take a few minutes for research? Is there an atlas in the bookcase? Mrs. Pigeon laughed and said, of course. She went to the bookcase and took out a book of maps called an atlas. Now, said Gooney Bird, would you find out if there are any other Chinas? Other Chinas? I don't think. Mrs. Pigeon began turning the pages of the atlas. She found the index at the back. My goodness, Miss Pigeon said after minutes. There is a China in Texas. Correct, said Gooney Bird. And what else? There's a China in Maine. Correct, said Gooney Bird. And California. There's a China Lake. Oh, my goodness, look, in North Carolina. And now it's time to continue the story, Gooney Bird announced. Where were we? Oh, yes, I remember. The moving van had just left China. She took up the story again. After the moving van left China, the Green family loaded up their station wagon, and with 5 big suitcases, they added a lawnmower that they had forgotten to put in the moving van, a cooler full of ham sandwiches and iced tea, a bundled up stack of National Geographics, and an orange and white cat named Catman, who had no tail because he had flicked his former tail once under the lawnmower. The last thing they put into the station wagon was a rolled up rug from the front porch of their house. It was too long to fit. They tied it sideways and folded it upside down, but it still wouldn't fit. Let's leave it behind, Mr. Green suggested. But Mrs. Green began to cry. It was my mother, she said. There's a stain on it where my mother spilled some black bean soup 40 years ago. I feel sentimental about this rug. So Mr. Green agreed to take the rug because it made him cry too, if his wife cried. He decided to put the back window of the station wagon down so that the end of the rolled up rug could stick out. He had made certain that everything was nicely arranged and that Catman had a comfortable place to sleep on the back seat, just beneath the end of the rug and next to the place where Gooney Bird would sit. Mr. Green and Mrs. Green and Gooney Bird Green all got into the car and drove away from China, starting their long journey to Watertown. They drove for many, many hours. They ate all of the ham sandwiches and drank all of the iced tea. They stopped to get gas. They went to the bathroom. They played the car radio and listened to news and operas and football games and talks about long love relationships. Suddenly, Gooney Bird glanced down and noticed with dismay that her beloved Catman had disappeared. She looked around on the floor of the back seat, but Catman was not there. She heard a small sound like a purr coming from inside the rolled up rug. She knew that Catman had entered the rug. He probably found it warm and dark and a cozy place. But Gooney Bird was worried about Catman. She decided to try to get him out. She reached into the rolled up center of the rug, but he slithered away beyond her hands. She looked at the backs of her parents' heads, wondering if she could tell them about the problem with Catman. But her mother was dozing and her father was driving, watching the road carefully and listening to a radio program about whales. So Gooney Bird decided to wiggle into the rug herself to rescue Catman. "Oh no," Calico cried. "I'm going to faint." "Shh," the other children said. It was dark and dusty and a very tight squeeze inside the rolled-up rug. But Gooney Bird wiggled inch by inch toward Catman. Catman slithered away inch by inch. She could see his glittering eyes as he backed away from her hands. Gooney Bird was determined to rescue him. She continued forward. Suddenly, an amazing thing happened. Even though Gooney Bird was not very large and did not weigh very much and was not wearing her heavy diamond earrings from the palace that day, her weight inside the rolled-up rug caused it to tilt. At that moment, Mr. Green leaned forward to change the radio station, and the car went over a pothole in the rug. The rolled-up rug, containing both Catman and Gooney Bird, slid out of the back of the station wagon and flew through the air before it landed at the side of the road. In some thick grass beside a fence post. A cow chewing a purple flower looked curiously at it and then wandered away. The station wagon drove on around a curve in the road. Slowly the rug unrolled. Catman's fur was standing on end, and if he had had a tail, his tail would have been sticking straight up in the air. For a moment, Catman stood up, looking at Gooney Bird, then he ran away very fast. Gooney Bird sat up. She was not entirely sure what had happened, but she was not hurt. She simply wondered where her family was, and her cat, and the car. Other cars stopped and people got out. Many people offered her a drink of water from their bottles of Evelyn, but Gooney Bird wasn't thirsty. After a while, a police car with a flashing light came, a TV reporter, and a cameraman. While the policeman talked on his radio, the TV reporter, a woman with a very large hair, interviewed Gooney Bird and called her the little girl who had a flying carpet ride. In the interview, Gooney Bird described Catman and asked people to call the station if they found him, but she never got Catman back. Eventually, the police car took her to her parents, who were both crying at the gas station 4 miles down the road. When Gooney Bird and her parents were finally reunited, everyone, including 2 policemen, a TV reporter, and the gas station owner, hugged and kissed and did the tango. The end. "What a lovely story," Mrs. Pigeon said. "An exciting one, too, but a little sad to lose your kitty that way." "Catman is not a kitty," Gooney Bird said. "He is a cat, and I didn't say that I lost him. I said that I never got him back." "So no one found him and called the TV station?" "Actually, they did," Gooney Bird replied. "But where's Catman now?" asked Mrs. Pigeon. "He was consumed by a cow," Gooney Bird said. "But that's a different story." "By a cow? You're joking," Mrs. Pigeon said. "No," said Gooney Bird. "I'm not joking. I only tell absolutely true stories." Tell it, the children called. "I will," Gooney Bird said. "Another day." Alright, so that is the end of chapter 3 of Gooney Bird Green, and we see she tells another one of her crazy stories to her class. And I'm going to ask a couple questions just to make sure that you understood what was happening in that story. So, one thing is, what was the flying object that she took a ride on? It was a carpet. Remember, it was a flying carpet. And she was moving from China to Watertown. And she discovered with her class there's more than just one China that's a foreign country, but there was a China in Texas, there was a China in California, there's a China in Maine, there's a China in a lot of different places. So she talks about the journey that she took from China to her new town of Watertown. And she tells this story of the journey and her trying to get her cat out of the carpet, which sounds like a crazy story, right? I don't think I've ever experienced anything like that. And if you guys have, you should definitely take a minute to write that story down so that maybe when we all come back to Thrive, you can tell us that story too. Or any crazy story that you have. But that's the end of chapter 3 of our book, and I'll see you next time for chapter 4. See you later, guys.